It's a huge honor to have you all with us today. I wish we could be doing this in person, but the situation in Ukraine and technology requires us to do this online. I think I'd start by saying that our mission at Freedom House of creating a world, or helping create a world in which all people are free, has unfortunately never been more relevant than today. And we are deeply concerned, but also hopeful about the future trajectory of democracy. I'd like to extend a special welcome to our Freedom House trustee and political scientist, Frank Fukuyama, and to Assistant Secretary of State, Karen Donfried, who will be joining me and Frank and our honoree for a discussion later in the program. Thank you so much for being with us today. Since 2011, the Mark Palmer Prize has been awarded by Freedom House to diplomats or international public servants who demonstrate not just commitment, but courage and follow through in their support for democracy and human rights. And there Karen Donfried is. Welcome, Karen. Mark Palmer led a long and storied career in the Foreign Service, including 4 years as U.S. Ambassador to Hungary during the communist era, and he was the State Department's top criminologist at the first Reagan-Gorbachev summit. He remained a pillar of democracy support after leaving government, and we know him well from Freedom House, where he served as our vice chair for many years, and we benefited enormously from his counsel and devotion to our cause. I am thrilled also to welcome our guest of honor, the recipient of the 2022 Mark Palmer Prize for Advancing Democracy, Ukraine's Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs, Emine Shapar. The Russian invasion of Ukraine and the inspiring ongoing battle for freedom by Ukraine prevents us from presenting this award to you in person, but I'm glad we can honor you at least virtually today. Throughout her career as a journalist, diplomat, and Crimean Tatar rights advocate, and being a Crimean Tatar herself, the Deputy Minister has embodied Mark's dearest held values of integrity, creativity, and courage. She has fought relentlessly for the rights of imprisoned journalists and for the rights of Crimean Tatars who have faced long-standing political persecution and repression by Russian and Soviet authorities, and she has worked to strengthen human rights protections in Ukraine more broadly. The Kremlin and its senseless war of conquest are a threat to freedom, not just in Ukraine, but for all of us. And and the Deputy Minister and her colleagues are on the front lines of what we at Freedom House see as a global tug-of-war struggle between democracy and authoritarianism. To tell us about the origins of the Mark Palmer Prize and to present this year's award, I'm going to introduce Dr. Sushma Palmer, who, in addition to being founder of the Mark Palmer Prize, is also a dedicated member of our Board of Trustees. And thanks to Sushma's generosity and commitment to carrying on her late husband's legacy, we have the opportunity to gather and reflect on the state of freedom worldwide and shine a spotlight on this extraordinary public servant. After the award ceremony, after Sushma presents the award, we'll hear from the Deputy Minister for a few minutes, and then we'll have a conversation about the situation in Ukraine, joined by Frank and Karen. So, Sushma, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you, Mike, for those eloquent remarks. And my special thanks also to Freedom House for making it possible for me to continue the Mark Palmer Prize for Diplomats. We established the prize in 2011, as Mark mentioned, and it was with the goal of recognizing diplomats and then more recently also associates of international organizations who share my late husband Mark's vision, which was to assist nations and civil society to promote democracy and human rights. Mark's lifelong passion for advancing democracy and opening closed societies emanated at Yale in the 1960s when he became a freedom rider in the civil rights movement, and it persisted throughout his life. I met Mark in 1964, soon after he arrived on his first Foreign Service post in New Delhi. On our first date, he invited me to the Tibetan monastery for dinner. And as we sat cross-legged on the floor and dined on yak soup, I soon realized we weren't there for dinner at all. Mark was there to support Tibetans in their struggle for independence from China. For the next 3 decades, Mark dedicated his Foreign Service career to pushing democracy promotion to the forefront of US foreign policy. Notable among his several successful efforts is his key role in crafting President Reagan's landmark democracy address to the British Parliament in 1982. This is what helped launch the National Endowment for Democracy and also several NGOs. Then in the 1980s, as Mike mentioned, as US Ambassador to Hungary, Mark became an inspiration to Hungarian dissidents. And in 1989, he decided to defy the State Department and march in the streets of Budapest with dissidents in support of democracy. His democracy crusade carried over into his private sector career in the 1990s, where he pioneered independent TV news stations in several Eastern European countries, including in Ukraine. And later he launched and supported a number of democracy-oriented organizations back in the US. Mark was bold, engaging, idealistic, unconventional, and a change agent. He was a perennial optimist and a visionary. His ultimate vision was a world without dictators. And to honor Mark's vision, Freedom House, as mentioned by Mike, has been giving the Mark Palmer Prize for Diplomats every year since 2011. And this year, Freedom House has selected Ukraine's first deputy foreign minister, Emin Shapar, to receive the 2022 Mark Palmer Prize, especially for championing democracy and human rights for all Ukrainian people. Minister Shapar has been instrumental in ensuring that democracy prevails despite Russia's cruel aggression that has pitched Ukraine in a battle between democracy and authoritarianism. Madam Minister, we applaud your leadership on steps to reverse Russia's occupation of Crimea and protect rights of Crimean Tatars, and your call for investigation of reported war crimes by Russian troops. Your advocacy for the rights of imprisoned journalists, your efforts to rally the international community in support of Ukraine, and your long-standing support of human rights protections in Ukraine are all exemplary. Minister Shaparova, it's my great honor to present you the Mark Palmer Prize for Diplomats. Congratulations. And thank you, Mike. Thank you. And thank you, Minister Shapar, for being here today. It's a great honor to meet you virtually, if not in person. I hope that someday we will have that pleasure. Thank you.
Please go ahead, ma'am.
Am I given the floor, dear Michael? Thank you. Thank you so much, dear Michael, Karen, Francis, Sushma, ladies and gentlemen. It is a great honor for me to receive the Mark Palmer Prize. And let me first of all thank Freedom House for awarding me, and personally to Madam Sushma for establishing the prize dedicated to democracy and human dignity, because this is exactly what brave Ukrainian people are fighting for and unfortunately dying for today. The horrible war in my country did not allow me to be with you in person, but this remarkable day will always be in my heart. And I take this prize as not only a woman leader or a warrior for justice and human rights, but as a true citizen of my country, as a Ukrainian who every day, together with millions of my compatriots, fight for very basic and very fundamental things: to survive, to revive, and to share. Share life, love, freedom, and dignity, something that every human being without exception would want to share. But the history proves that to be a human and to be a part of humankind is not always a given thing. In our modern world, it has been questioned by a nuclear P5 country, guarantor of peace and security all around the globe, one of the biggest countries with one of the biggest armies in the world, Russia. By its perverted ambition to have more land, more influence, more power, more resources, and more slaves of its dictatorship. But the emptiness of this more will never be satisfied, as evil can never be satisfied. Therefore, I would like to dedicate this award to my country, Ukraine, to my compatriots Ukrainians, to my homeland, Crimea, and to my people, Crimean Tatars, Kırımlı, who suffered the annexation of 1783 by Russian Empire, genocide of deportation of 1944 by Communist Russia, and crime of aggression and occupation of 2014 by Putin's Russia. And the result of all these heinous centuries-long crimes is that Crimean Tatars are the physical minority in their homeland, and the Crimean Tatar language is the world's red book. Back in 2014, when me and my husband decided to escape from the prison of Russian tyranny in Crimea, my 5-year-old daughter Iman invited me into, without exaggeration, life-changing conversation. She asked me, "Mommy, let us take a present and give it to President Volodymyr Putin." I said, this might not work out, because she thought that if we give this present to President Putin, so he will be pleased and give the peninsula back. Then she asked me, "Mommy, let us buy a gun at the toy shop and try to fear him. If he's scared, he will give us Crimea back." And I replied that this probably would not be the case. She thought for a while and asked, "Does he have children?" I said, "Probably yes." And then she came to the most mature conclusion I have ever heard. She said, "If he loves his children, why does he commit this cruelty to all of us?" And in that very moment, she told me, "Mommy, you should do something about this." We left the peninsula in 2 cars with my daughter Iman and cat in the basket. Since then, the only way how I could possibly deal with this feeling of despair and inability to change the situation was to free my Kırım, my homeland. In 2014, I joined the Ukrainian government, and it gave me a great sense of privilege and responsibility to be the voice of my people, both domestically and abroad. And the dream to return Crimea home leads me up in my life up till these days. And in this regard, let me share the major project in my career life, the International Crimea Platform, a unique coordination mechanism and a diplomatic tool which is worldwide and world known today. It was once born deeply in my heart, written on the 1 A4 page by me and my friend, Ukrainian expert Yulia Kazdobina, as we aimed to bring Crimean issue back on the international agenda. A couple of years after that developments, when Foreign Minister Kuleba invited me to join the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, I said that I would be honored to if we launch a Crimea platform, and he said yes. And it was almost as joyful as if someone says yes at the marriage proposal. I received a huge credit of trust from my boss, Minister Kuleba, and my big boss, President Zelensky, who supported the idea of the Crimea platform and really performed true leadership in making it a success story of my country. The International Crimea Platform started as one-page concept. Now it unites almost 60 countries from Americas, Europe, Asia, and Africa over the ultimate goal, the occupation of Crimea and restoration of justice and territorial integrity of Ukraine. Defending human rights is one of the pillars of the Crimea platform. We united prominent foreign and Ukrainian human rights defenders to tell the truth to the world about Russia's atrocities on the peninsula, Just imagine that the current number of years for Ukrainian political prisoners in Crimea is almost 1,300 years. Among them are 14 citizen journalists who were not afraid to speak out loud. And to support them, a couple of years ago, we launched a project of public mentoring by internationally renowned persons. Each mentor acts as a public voice in support of one of the detained citizen journalists. It helps us and helps to keep the spirit of political prisoners high, not to allow them to be forgotten. And I'm glad that one of the mentors, Mr. Francis Fukuyama, is with us today. Sarolnas, Mr. Fukuyama. I believe that Russia is really afraid of our joint efforts. That's why, after the inaugural Crimea Platform Summit in 2021, Russia included me into its sanction list together with Minister Kuleba. And just yesterday, FSB requested Moscow court to arrest me. This is nothing but revenge for, I believe, this strong diplomatic fight for Crimea. The same they did to my friend Nariman Zhilal, deputy head of the Majlis of the Crimean Tatar people, who was arrested right after participation in the inaugural summit of the Crimea Platform. He is now sentenced to 17 years in prison. Along with Nariman, occupiers put behind bars brothers Asan and Aziz Akhtemovs. Asan is my relative. He received 15 years in prison, and Aziz received 13 years in prison for nothing. Dear colleagues, February 24th became another turning point in my life as well as in lives of millions of Ukrainians. With the power of the government, I was evacuated from Kiev to Western Ukraine, and I had only a handbag with me, literally without anything in hand. With all my life and plans behind in a city under Russia's bombs and missiles. All Ukrainians knew that we had no choice but to fight with conviction. And then we started to impress the world with our bravery and resilience. And in the first days of full-scale invasion, our partners kept asking us, how long will you withstand? And now the world believes in our victory and shows support in our fight. And I feel that by awarding me today, you all believe in us, in what we are doing. As Russian invaders failed to achieve their military goals and find themselves incapable to fight against Ukrainian army, they resorted to terror of civilians. They literally want to leave us without electricity, water, food, something which is very basic for living. And I want to seize this opportunity and to send the message on behalf of all Ukrainians. Keep supporting Ukraine and help us to win as soon as possible, because only Ukraine's victory will ensure that justice and democracy prevail. Because dictatorship like Russia cannot dictate the agenda to the free world. The establishment of the special tribunal to hold Russian leadership accountable for the crime of aggression is the only way to safeguard that the tragedy will never repeat itself. Evil must be punished in the name of all those who sacrificed their lives for freedom. Thus, I want to call on the international community to support the United Nations resolution on the establishment of a special tribunal. Russia must understand the world is not scared and has enough leverage to put in place the aggressor. Dear friends, I think that we can make a difference for the future generation, just like Ambassador Mark Palmer did in Hungary by encouraging civil society for changes. During his cadence in 1989, official Budapest cut through once electrified barbed wire on the border with Austria. This was the moment when the Iron Curtain fell. That occasion marked the beginning of the end of the Cold War era, and Moscow could not put up with the collapse of the Soviet Union and made permanent attempts to restore its empire of evil by waging wars and destabilizing against independent states like Moldova, Georgia, and now my country, Ukraine. It also prevented other post-Soviet states like Belarus from choosing their own way. Back in 1919, the process of ending the era of confrontation of Soviet imperialism was not finished. And the reality in which we live today is closely linked to that time. The victory over Russia today will mean the end of imperialism and will turn into ash the wall Russia is trying to rebuild. We must, and I believe we shall, prove our freedom and democratic values that are stronger than authoritarian darkness. Now Ukrainians write the new history of the modern world, and outline features of the emerging world order. We all have a unique chance to build a new reality we always dreamt about: free, prosperous, and democratic. And I'm sure that very soon my daughter and my daughters, as well as millions of other Ukrainian children who were separated from their homeland, will be able to return home. And I thank you for the prize, for your support, and for everything that you do for my people and for my country. Sağolunuz.
Thank you very much, Minister, for that deeply inspiring speech and for your words. And I can only say that in America, we support you at Freedom House, and we are just inspired by the example of you and your fellow citizens standing up for freedom. So thank you very much. We're honored to present you with this award. It could not be more fitting. Now as I mentioned earlier, we are joined by two really distinguished guests who I'm most grateful to, and I'm happy to can count both of them as friends. Dr. Frank Fukuyama, who's on the board of Freedom House, and also Dr. Karen Donfried, who is serving as Assistant Secretary of State for Europe. Karen and Frank, welcome. We have about half an hour for a conversation, which will also include the minister and we have a good audience. I'll just say to the audience, if you have questions, I have a lot of questions, but if you have a good question, put it in the chat and we'll see if we can get to it. But we have a hard stop at the end of the hour. But let me just start with a very quick question to each of the panelists, and I'd like to start with Karen, then Frank, and then come back to the minister. Give us a quick assessment of the state of the war so far, and what lessons we've learned from the last 10 years. And I'd also say to both Karen and Frank, if you want to have any reactions to the award itself, you're welcome to make some comments. So Karen, over to you first.
Well, Mike, first, thank you so much for the invitation. It's great to see you. It's great to be part of a Freedom House event. And it's particularly special to be a part of this event. Warm congratulations, Madam Minister, on this really well-deserved award. I can only echo Mike's thanks for your remarks. And I think in a way, they speak to what our assessment of the past 10 months has been. And that has been truly being inspired by the Ukrainian people. Your incredible bravery, your resilience in the face of a brutal, unprovoked Russian attack on your country. And I think we look at what you have achieved over these 10 months, and I don't at all mean to push aside the tragedy of these 10 months and the many innocent Ukrainians who have died as a result of this Russian invasion, but your bravery in standing up to defend your country and the kind of world that we want to live in is so powerful. And when I think about the significance of what's playing out in Ukraine, in the first instance, of course, it's existential for Ukrainians. It also has profound implications for the European security landscape and ultimately for global stability. Because what's at the root of this battle are the values that we believe in, and they're the values that Freedom House as an organization embodies. We're fighting for democracy, human rights, the right of a country to decide the sort of foreign or security policy it wants to have. We're fighting against the principle that might makes right. And we want to live in a world that is ordered around rules that are broadly accepted and are embodied in the UN Charter. There are so many things that are at stake in this war. And I can say that the Biden administration is deeply committed with supporting Ukraine, standing with Ukraine until this war is over. And this war will be over when Ukraine wins. So we will continue to stand by nothing about Ukraine without Ukraine, and we are privileged to stand with you in this fight. Let me just stop with that, Mike. Thanks.
Thank you. Frank.
Thanks, Mike, and thanks to Freedom House for inviting me to be part of this. I should say before I answer your question that I knew Mark Palmer personally when I was in the State Department during the Reagan administration, which is going back a few decades, and I'm very pleased to be able to honor that his memory is being honored as well. And I also know Amina Japar. We tried to get her to Stanford a few years ago before the war, but she obviously had a higher calling to go on to, and she's done a marvelous job there. I'm really also honored to be a participant in the Crimean platform that she mentioned. It's very important not to forget the people the individuals that have been repressed by Russia. And I would just like to read the names of 3 citizen journalists that I've been asked to be a particular mentor to, Mr. Arif Mehmetov, Mr. Suleimanov, and Mr. Sheikh Aliyev. They are in prison. They've been sentenced to long prison terms for being willing to speak the truth on behalf of the Crimean Tatar community. And I hope that we don't forget them, and I hope that they will be liberated at the moment when Ukraine does win this war. I would like to echo the things that Assistant Secretary Donfried said. This war has always been about much more than just Ukraine. It really was launched in an effort to not simply grab as much of Ukraine as possible and overthrow its democratically elected regime, but really as part of a longer term campaign on the part of Putin to upset the entire post-1991 European order, the Europe whole and free that Mark Palmer worked for, that liberated any number of countries from Soviet tutelage. And I think that, the significance to me of what Ukraine has done in the past 10 months is it's really shown, I think, a lot of people in the West the need that they actually, first of all, are in danger, that their security is not something that can be taken for granted, but also that democracy itself is something that is worth fighting and dying for. I'm afraid that in Europe, particularly Western Europe, and in the United States and North America, we've lived under a peaceful democracy for such a long time because of the liberal institutions that were put in place after 1945 that many people, especially many young people, have come to take democracy for granted. And they've not really had to struggle for their ability to speak and act and travel and move about as they please. And I think that the Russian invasion has shown that those freedoms can be taken away, and that if you don't fight for them, they're not going to exist. And so in that respect, I think Ukraine has set they've shown what risk and struggle are all about, and I think that that's why it is extremely important that this that Russia be defeated in this broader project that they have embarked on.
Thank you, Frank. Minister, can you say just a few words about your assessment of the situation over the last 10 months and what you think our audiences might not know that they should know about what's happening?
Yes, with pleasure. I think that the major outcome of this 10 months of war is actually goes with 3 points. The first one is that Ukrainians and we ourselves, we realized that we are a strong nation, that we are a nation actually. The second is that we destroyed this myth about Russia being the second largest army in the world, because we've been always living in this fear that, Russia is a superpower. And then I think that this projected fear was always the case since 2014. And I remember, because I've been dealing with diplomacy at my previous capacity, how difficult it was to break through this narrative that Russia is strong, that, okay, when it came to Crimea, the discussion was always, let's say, in a way reflected that Russia would fight for it, and then it would use the nuclear weaponry. I mean, the main thing that we managed to perform is that even despite this myth about Russia being the second largest army in the world, Ukraine keeps fighting and keeps resisting. And the third, that we prove that nothing is impossible and that everything is possible if and when there is a united and joint effort, because we couldn't believe that Russia would be expelled from the Council of Europe half a year ago, or Russia would be expelled from the Human Rights Council in Geneva. But today, something that we never expected to have is happening. And this is what we are appealing for all the time, saying that we have to be stronger, we have to consolidate our efforts, and this is the only way how the civilized world can act.
Thank you for that. Let me turn back to Assistant Secretary Donfried for a minute. A question that I think both you and Frank alluded to in your initial comments, but I think would be important for our audiences, which is, why does the outcome of this war matter to people outside of Ukraine? I mean, we obviously know why it matters to people in Ukraine. They're fighting for their lives, for their democracy. But why does it matter to people in Pennsylvania, people in France, people in Latin America, people in India? Talk a little bit more in depth about the broader significance of this struggle and the kind of overall struggle for democracy.
So, Mike, thank you for that. And I was alluding to it in my first answer, because I think fundamentally the war in Ukraine is about the kind of world we want to live in. You know, are Americans okay with a bigger, stronger country invading its weaker neighbor and taking its territory? I don't think that's the world most Americans want to live in. So it gets to this rules-based international order, which is a political science wonky term. But what we mean by that is living in a world where people have the freedom to make choices about the kind of country they want to live in and the kind of foreign and security policy that country pursues. And do they have individual rights? Is there a free press? All of these things that Frank Fukuyama so eloquently said, maybe we Americans have come to take for granted, and maybe many West Europeans have too, that it reminds us that there are fundamental principles and values that are worth fighting for. That's what the Ukrainians are doing, and we as Americans are doing everything we can to support them in that fight. So I do think that is fundamental to the struggle. And I think the Ukrainians have shown themselves to be remarkable partners in this when we see the hardship they're living through. And one of the changes we've seen in the war over these past 10 months is, starting on October 10, we saw Russia start barraging Ukraine's civilian infrastructure. So we see the Russians now targeting key energy nodes. They're really weaponizing winter, and they are trying to plunge a country of 44 million into cold and darkness as snow already has begun falling in different parts of the country. This is abhorrent, and we should be standing up and saying, this is wrong. We denounce it. We call on Russia to stop. And I would note that if we think of the United Nations General Assembly as the court of world opinion, we have seen resolutions pass in the General Assembly by large numbers. The most recent one was a condemnation of Russia's sham referenda and illegal annexation of yet more Ukrainian territory, where 143 countries stood up and said, this is wrong, we condemn it, and Russia needs to stop. So I do think you also see not only the US and its close allies and partners, but the vast majority of the countries in the world standing up saying, this is not the world we want to live in. Thanks.
Great. Frank, if you want to add anything on that, I think Karen said it pretty well, but I am interested in something. You've been quite bullish for months that Ukraine is going to win the war. You and I talked about that last spring, like really like a week after the war had started. You you were writing, I think that Russia's going to lose and that Ukraine's going to win, and it's just a matter of time. So tell us why you're so bullish on Ukraine from an analytical point of view.
Well, it's based on a couple of things. You know, my center, the Center on Democracy Development and the Rule of Law at Stanford, has been running a series of leadership programs. We've gone to Ukraine, you know, numerous times since 2014 to teach mid-career, you know, up-and-coming Ukrainian leaders about leadership skills. We had a Ukrainian Emerging Leaders program where we brought Ukrainians to Stanford. And quite a number of people that were involved in the Maidan revolution, the revolution of dignity, and are now serving in important positions in the Ukrainian government have gone through our various programs. And from that, I had a clear sense of what Amina said about the strong sense of Ukrainian national identity that has developed. This is something that Putin did not understand. He somehow thought that, you know, Ukrainians were second-rate Russians and that they would welcome this Russian intervention, and simply did not understand that Ukraine is its own country with its own traditions and, you know, a very strong sense of solidarity. The other thing is that, you know, I started my career actually as a analyst of Soviet military affairs. I worked initially at the RAND Corporation after the State Department. And, you know, it just struck me that the Russians were really bad, and they were particularly bad at military logistics. And I think that, you know, you've had this very bad dynamic. Every time the war slows, you get calls for negotiations, you know, for peace. Where people don't understand that any negotiation short of Ukrainian victory is simply going to allow the Russians time to rearm. I think we're in a kind of period like that now after the liberation of Kherson. But I think I'm still optimistic because I think that right now the Russian position on the left bank of the Dnipro River is not all that strong. I think, you know, Ukraine needs to take that area back and break that land corridor between Russia and Crimea. And I think this will be a prelude to eventually retaking Crimea itself. This is a kind of remarkable, you know, development because I think at the beginning, you know, back on February 24th, everybody was, you know, just wanting Ukraine to hang on in any way possible. But the idea that this war could actually lead to the liberation of the Crimean Peninsula was something that in our wildest imaginations, you know, we didn't really envision. And I think it's, you know, it's a testament to the effectiveness of the Ukrainian military that they are now in a position to realize as ambitious a goal as this. And I think for the Crimean Tatar community, this is extremely important, you know, and this is why I do think that it's quite important for the United States to continue to support Ukraine with military equipment at the, you know, at the highest possible level so that this goal can be realized.
Thank you, Frank. Minister, I'd like to come to you. You alluded in your remarks to the situation in Crimea. And I'd like, you know, this has been an issue for you, as you indicated, from well before you came into government. So I'm wondering if you can talk about generally how is the human rights situation for the people in the occupied territories changed over the last 10 months? Can you give us some, you know, some insight into that? And I include in that, you know, the information environment inside Crimea and the other occupied territories. How do we help the independent media reach people in the occupied territories, and how do we get those stories out? So give us some insight into what is happening that you know of in the occupied territories right now.
Yeah, thank you, Michael, for your question. But before I go answering your question, I also to reflect to something that Francis said about attempt to invite me to Stanford. I wish that, and I know that I will try to have yet another attempt to be a Stanford student once I finish my big tasks that I have in the ministry. When it comes to the situation with the human rights in Crimea, of course, it got worse since 24th of February. Well, there are the tendencies, same tendencies as we started to witness it in 2014, like forcible passportization, because without passport, without Russian passport, we call it Ausweis, you cannot get access to anything, to education, to healthcare. So of course, millions of Ukrainian citizens were forced to get Russian passports, and thus in the face of Russian legislation or judicial system, all those criminal code articles have been applied to our citizens. And if you dare to say, publicly say that Crimea is Ukraine, you can be put in the prison at least 5 years in Crimea. Then change of demographics landscape, because by having this criminal code change, they squeezed out loyal Ukrainians. Thousands of Ukrainians left and abandoned the peninsula, like myself, but they brought at least 800,000 of newcomers, of Russian citizens, and kind of they're trying to shape loyal population. And they did it in 1944, for example, when they deported every single Crimean Tatar. They brought Russian people to the peninsula by shaping, pro-Russian population. And they did it in 1783 when the first annexation happened, because as the result of the Russian Empire annexation, 1/3 of indigenous population fled to Ottoman Empire. So this is a very classical practice, I would say. But the new one is mobilization, because when Russia announced about the conscription into the Russian army and mobilization, they disproportionately put in the Russian army Crimean Tatars. Well, you all know that Crimean Tatars, in the majority of cases, they have pro-Ukrainian position. It's a very cynical act, to put Ukrainians to fight against Ukrainians in the Russian army. And this is what we are also trying to raise awareness about by different information campaigns. And the question about how you can support, actually, I'm very thankful. And let me also express this gratitude on behalf of those journalists and media outlets, because I once launched the Crim Reality website with the Radio Freedom and Radio Liberty in Crimea, because the first step that Russia did was not only occupation of the territory itself, but they occupied the media infrastructure. These are the TV towers, even the frequencies, TV and radio frequencies that belong to Ukraine according to ITU in Geneva. They occupied it and they started broadcasting their national or regional media, so, and jamming the internet traffic. So what we understand should be done is to keep on information campaigns, keep on launching content about the real situation, because it's the only alternative to what Russian media is providing as propaganda. And then the final point is actually ban the Russian media, because today, unfortunately, Sputnik or Russia Today is a tool of serious propaganda, because Western concept when it comes to information security mostly focuses on cybersecurity. But I'm sure that this phenomenon of impact of propaganda and influences on people's hearts and minds is something that is not explored enough. Because, for example, if you have friends or relatives or, I don't know, experts in Russia, whenever and whatever picture or video you show, you cannot break through. So they just don't believe you. And I think that it's a phenomenal thing that needs to be explored.
Thank you for that. Let me turn, if I may, to Karen and tee up a different subject for all the panelists to think about. But we've had, the political situation has been evolving outside of Ukraine. We'll have a Republican Congress starting in January. Europe is facing a difficult winter. I'd like to first start with Karen. Do you see challenges ahead for continued outside support for Ukraine? How do you assess that, and what is the administration trying to do to kind of make sure that your policies continue until, as you said, victory happens?
Well, thanks for that question, Mike. And I think there's been a lot of buzz about will the United States continue its strong support for Ukraine going forward? And I'm not sure it's a Republican Congress. I mean, we'll have a Republican House and we'll have a Democratic majority, an increased Democratic majority in the US Senate. So we'll have divided government. And I will say, you know, as someone who is living in a deeply polarized country, one area where there has been quite remarkable bipartisan support has been for Ukraine. And, you know, we have another supplemental with the Hill right now, but I will never forget the moment I heard that Congress had increased our second supplemental to $40 billion. And the broad and deep support there has been in Congress to continue our support for Ukraine at this level has really been critical for our effort. So maybe a shout out to all those members of Congress who have been so committed to Ukraine in this fight, because for all of the bravery and resilience of Ukrainians, I think the deputy minister would be the first on the screen to say that the weapons and security assistance the United States has been providing to Ukraine has been essential to Ukraine's war effort. And it's a tribute to the Ukrainians how well they're using that equipment, but it is really quite remarkable the level of security assistance that has been going to Ukraine from the United States and from so many other allies and partners around the world. And I would add to that the economic support and the humanitarian assistance. And the administration could not do that without the broad bipartisan support we found in Congress. Are there voices in both parties who are critical of that high level of support? Yes. But I do think you are going to see the breadth and depth of the bipartisan support continue into the next Congress. So I actually feel quite confident that you will see that. And I will say, if you extend that out to, let's take the next circle, which would be maybe our European allies and partners. I had the privilege of being with Secretary Blinken at the NATO Foreign Ministerial last week in Bucharest. And it was just so inspiring to hear from all 30 NATO allies how committed they are to Ukraine and, in President Zelensky's terms, to support Ukraine achieving a just peace. There was not a dissonant voice around that table. We had the pleasure of having Ukraine's foreign minister, Dmytro Kuleba, there with us, who spoke very eloquently about where Ukraine is in this war right now and what he needs from the alliance going forward. There's increasingly a focus, along with weapons, which is always at the top of any Ukrainian's list when they talk to us. There's also an increased focus on energy infrastructure. Because as Russia is hitting these critical nodes, how can we both provide more air defense to help protect that critical infrastructure, but also we're looking around the world to help bring replacement equipment in to assure that Ukrainians continue to have light and heat and water through this winter. So I do feel confident in the support that is there across the broad alliance that's been built on Ukraine's side in this war.
Thanks for that. Frank, from the West Coast and from your perspective, do you share that optimism? What's your assessment of the political array of forces?
In comparison to Karen, I can be a little bit more pointed about American politics. It's true that Ukraine has gotten very strong bipartisan support over the past 10 months, but with every successive aid vote, an increasing number of House Republicans voted against the package. And I think that if the election that we just had, the midterm election, had produced the kind of red wave that many people were expecting, I think there would have been a real problem with Ukraine aid, because the right wing of the Republican Party would have felt much more empowered, and they really don't like Ukraine. And the leader of that wing is actually on the wrong side in terms of, Russia versus Ukraine. So I think that midterm election was actually very, very good for Ukraine. I think that threat has been beaten back. I think, Raphael Warnock's victory in Georgia has further steeled the view that Republicans espousing this kind of extreme, MAGA view are not going to do well in American politics going into the future. That has big implications, obviously, for the 2024 election. And so I'm reasonably optimistic about these changes. We're not out of the woods yet, but I do think that politics has been going in the right direction.
And Frank, can you say a quick word about Europe and like what you see in terms of Germany and other important countries there continuing to support the war effort?
Well, I think that, it's going to be tough for them, but they've actually had a lot of time to prepare for this winter. There's been a lot of gas that's been stored. I think a lot of German businesses are actually, struggling to adjust to the gas cutoff. And, we all wish that Germany would do more in terms of defense and be more decisive in making this, really historic shift in their foreign policy. But, it's tough for a country that's been very pacifist for, the last 70 years or so to be as decisive about this as we'd like. But I do think, and for example, you elected a populist party in Italy. You have a populist right-wing prime minister, but Giorgia Meloni has been very supportive of Ukraine. She's actually been very good on this particular issue and in terms of NATO solidarity. So I think that we're going to get through this.
Okay. Minister, what are your thoughts from where you sit on this issue of like, are you counting on continued support for your cause in world capitals? And I would say, let me just say one other thing. We're running a little bit out of time. So if you want to make any final points, please, you're welcome to, but we would be interested in your thoughts about the political situation from where you sit.
Yeah, thank you for the question. As Karen already mentioned, weapons, weapons, and weapons attitude that my country is actually expressing at every single international forum, because it is essential for us, it is crucial for us, and it is a matter of survival. So of course we rely on bipartisan support, even though we understand that there will always be a domestic discussion. But we also feel that we have a strong support from both of the parties. And of course, we would keep on requesting, we would keep on relying on the support of our partners, because if you compare the, let's say, capacity of both of the countries, when it comes to Ukraine and Russia, it's different. It's a different weight category at the boxing ring. So the only way how we can win, it is the, let's say, joint effort. And we feel this support. By studying international relations in my university, well, going back to the modern history, the First World War, the Second World War, in today's current situation, I have never met any case like Ukrainian that managed to unite that many countries all together, that many contradictive sometimes cases together. And I think that I remember I was in Doha in Qatar diplomatic forum, and I met the Syrian opposition leader, and he said that we all pray for Ukraine, but because we never had this support, tremendous support of the international community as you have. So I really mean it, saying that we feel it. But the question, if it's enough. So while the war is going on, probably it's not enough, because this is the war and it always needs resources. It needs weapons every day. And of course, our attitude, because Ukrainian diplomats, they by fortune became experts on weapons, on energy, on humanitarian issues. So we are dealing with everything that my country needs. But this is the only way we will keep on fighting for the country. So I will probably make my conclusion speech after Karen and Francis, if I may.
Absolutely. So let me just ask Karen and Frank, 30 seconds, any final points that you want to make that I haven't asked you about? Karen first.
So I'm just going to say, this is really hard. In the first instance, it is really hard for Ukraine. And again, as we go into winter and see the just horrific attacks Russia is launching against Ukraine, it's hard to watch. It's going to be a tough winter for our European allies and friends because of high energy prices, limited supplies, economic reverberations of this. It's hard more broadly for countries that depend on Ukraine for grain, with food insecurity increasing. We can go through all of the ways this is really challenging. But I think at the core, what Ukraine is showing us in terms of standing up for what they believe in, defending their country, is inspiring the rest of us. And I may feel, as a member of the Biden administration, proud of what we've done as an administration, proud of what we've done as a country with bipartisan support from Congress. But if you're Ukrainian, the message will always be, we need more. And that's exactly the right message that Ukraine should be sending, because they do need more. And so I can say that for this administration, we will continue to do everything we can 24/7 to get the most we can to Ukraine, to galvanize the world community to stand with Ukraine. And I am confident, as Frank was from day one, that Ukraine will win. Thank you.
Karen, thank you so much for being with us. I know that you have to sign off, but go do your meeting, and we really are very grateful for your time here. Thank you very much. I'm going to give Frank 30 seconds, and then we'll have the final word from the minister. Frank, please.
Well, I mean, I'll just second what Karen said. Give Ukraine what it wants, and I think they will take care of the rest.
Great. Minister, do you have any final words for our audience?
Well, let me first of all express my sincerest gratitude for today's event, for today's prize. I take it not only personally, but on behalf of my people who are resisting and demonstrating really bravery every day, every single second. While we are talking, our soldiers are fighting in the battlefield. And to conclude my speech, I will probably quote my president, who actually very eloquently expressed the formula of Ukraine for peace and security in the whole world. It's a 10-point peace formula of President Zelensky, which is radiation and nuclear security, food security, energy security, release of all prisoners of war and deportees and detainees, Ukrainian citizens, restoration of Ukrainian territorial integrity, respect for United Nations Charter, total withdrawal of all Russian troops from all over my country, punishment of crimes and for war crimes, protection for the environment, stopping Russia's ecocide in Ukraine, new security architecture and security guarantees for Ukraine, signing of a peace treaty, and this is the 10 steps how Ukraine sees its future. And just to conclude myself, I mean, we all know that every war comes to an end. We all fight so that this end comes as soon as possible. We will recover, and my personal formula that I shaped for myself is about survival, revival, and arrival. We will survive, we will revive, and we will arrive to the country that we are dreaming of, which is prosperous, European, civilized, democratic country. And I believe that we can do it with your help, and I'm very thankful for it. Salomos.
Well, thank you, Minister. We are deeply honored by your words, by your presence. You have a standing invitation to visit us at Freedom House when you come to Washington, D.C. We hope to welcome you here, and we support you. And to Frank, thank you so much for being with us and for being a great friend to Freedom House and to this cause. And to Sushma, of course, we love you. Thank you so much for helping us steward the legacy of Mark Palmer in such an innovative way. I mean, it's just been a great event. Thank you all, and thank you to all our audiences for joining us. We are done on time. Thank you very much, Minister, and thank you all. Goodbye. Oh, by the way, one thing, if you have
Thank you, Mike.
if you have an idea for next year, let us know. We're looking for good suggestions. Take care, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.